Welcome back to ACOP 2022. I'm Boon Xiang, a principal psychologist at the Home Team Behavioral Sciences Center in the Ministry of Home Affairs. I'll be the moderator for this 1-hour panel discussion, which is on desistance from theory to practice. Before we start, please take note of the following information and house rules. First, please refrain from recording the sessions or reproduce the content. The organizers, however, may record the session for publicity and archival purposes. Nevertheless, for non-sensitive content, you are encouraged to share your experiences and thoughts on our social media pages. Don't forget to hashtag ACOP 2022. Second, you'll be viewing this panel session on the conference platform. Do share your greetings with each other and comments under the chat function. Third, if you have questions for the panelists, please type them under the Q&A function. You may also upvote questions posed by others that you would like the panelists to respond to. If you need help with the conference platform, you may also reach out to the organizing team using the chat function. For further information on how to navigate the conference platform, you may access the self-help guide that has been uploaded onto the platform. Now let us get into business. Our panelists today will discuss a very important topic in a field of corrections with regard to supporting pro-social change in lives of justice-involved persons using a desistance-based approach. Primarily, the panelists will discuss the following broad questions. First, how can we better translate knowledge from desistance research into rehabilitation and reintegration practices for justice-involved persons? And second, what are some of the key levers which agents and partners in the criminal justice systems, for example, correctional leaders and officers, correctional psychologists and specialists, aftercare communities, families, employers, volunteers, religious groups, and the larger society? How can all these people be tapped on to support the desistance journey of justice-involved persons? These are really important questions to discuss as we continue to seek new and better ways to turn lives around, break the chain of reoffending, and make our society safer for everyone. Online with us right now, we have 4 esteemed panelists who possess rich academic, research, and operational knowledge and experience in the field of corrections. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the panelists who are with us today. First off is Associate Professor Jeffrey Pfeiffer from Swinburne University of Technology. Professor Pfeiffer? Yes, want to say hi to everyone?
Hello.
Yes. He is also an adjunct professor from Namibia University of Science and Technology. Professor Pfeiffer is a distinguished researcher, having published numerous peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and conference papers. Notably, he received the International Corrections and Prisons Association Annual Research Award on 2 occasions. Professor Pfeiffer also has rich field experience, having involved in training of staff from security agencies and testified as expert witness in courts. Second, we have Associate Professor Timothy Leow from Singapore University of Social Sciences. Professor Leow, please say hi to everyone.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. He is also a senior consultant psychologist from the Singapore Prison Service. Professor Leow is trained as clinical psychologist in New Zealand and led the Psychological and Correctional Rehabilitation Division in Singapore Prison Service in his previous appointment. During the period, he led the development and implementation of evidence-informed rehabilitation models and practices in the service. He is now with the Singapore University of Social Sciences, where he successfully started the first postgraduate forensic psychology program in Singapore this year. Third, I would like to welcome Mr. Terence Goh Sir, say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone.
He is the Deputy Commissioner, Operations and Rehabilitation of the Singapore Prison Service. It is more than 25 years of service. He held several key appointments, such as Commander of Cluster with 5 prison institutions, Director of Rehabilitation and Reintegration, and Director of Operations. Currently, as the Deputy Commissioner in charge of Operations and Rehabilitation and many other divisions, he oversees the entire spectrum of prison operations, from in-care to aftercare, making sure our prisons are safe and secure, and the inmates have the optimal conditions to experience pro-social change during and after their time in prisons. And last but not least, let us welcome back Professor David Best, who needs no further introduction. Professor Best, are you back with us?
I am. Yeah, here I am.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Best, for giving us a very insightful keynote address on the social and societal model of desistance and recovery. This panel discussion consists of 2 parts. In the first part, each panelist will give a 5 to 7 minute sharing in response to the broad questions highlighted earlier. In the second part, we will commence the Q&A session for the panelists to respond to questions from the audience. So let's kick off the first part, and I would like to welcome Professor Pfeiffer to share your 5 to 7 minutes view on the broad questions mentioned. Professor Pfeiffer, please.
Thanks very much, Boon-Siang, and thank you to the organizers for having me on board for this this panel to talk about this very important, very timely issue. Like Professor Best and many others, I'm in other parts of the world and struggling with late nights and things going on. So good morning to you, good evening to you, good night to you, wherever you are in the world, and looking forward to listening to a little bit of what the panel's putting together for us here. Look, I just had a couple of comments. I'll keep my comments fairly brief because I think the questions are where a lot of this is drawn out. And you know, I really take my hat off to Professor Best. It is not often that you see academics say, by the way, let me thank the people that are helping me out with this thing. We are a brutal crowd when it comes to that. We do share the blame pretty quickly with others, but the credit, we tend to not do that. So let me also start by saying that my comments here are actually comments that are no tribute to myself. They come from working with a number of correctional agencies, youth justice, adult corrections, community corrections, et cetera, here in Australia. As Professor Best has mentioned, Australia, like other jurisdictions, have now adopted frameworks which include the idea of desistance. But for many of us, if I can, coin a phrase, the devil is in the detail. And so it's this idea of, we go in to do training, for instance, with many of these organizations, and we'll say, look, your organization has officially adopted a desistance approach. And of course, you're working with frontline individuals, and their questions are, what does that mean? And what is my role? And to be quite frank, what's my motivation for joining this movement towards this? And so, again, my brief comments here are more based on that idea that we are clearly, from a forensic perspective, this is in all elements a paradigm shift. From a criminological point of view, from a correctional point of view, this is a shift from a historically ingrained treatment and recidivism approach that we've all been comfortable with and been ingrained with for the last countless number of years. And so I guess what I would suggest is, in addition to continuing to demonstrate the effectiveness of a desistance approach within a criminological approach itself, it's really time to also think from our perspective, what is the strategic buy-in or implementation proactive approach as well, right? I mean, how do we really not say something that, again, I hesitate to say, but academics are well used to with senior management saying, we're going to make a shift to blended learning, and the professors who deliver all this information saying, yeah, but what does that mean for us? And the response is classically, look, that's detail that we don't deal with at this level. We'll work out the details later. I don't think that's the most effective approach. I think now is the time to start thinking about how we get buy-in from the various levels that are involved in this, how we can do it proactively. And I guess I would limit mine to a couple of examples. One would be managing up and managing down. And so, what is the strategy? Are we developing a strategy? And how can we assist as academics, as researchers, with a strategy to, again, work with a senior management that evolves right back to politicians, which evolve back to taxpayers, who are historically ingrained in the idea that individuals who've come in contact with the justice system require treatment, and the measure is recidivism. It's the R. That's all there is. And like Professor Best and others, I travel around the world, and if you're talking to senior management from commissioner on up, it's recidivism. You go into politics, it's recidivism, right? And so, how do we, as a simple example, how do we get politicians, the public, the media, in fact, to start using terms like relapse as opposed to reoffending? And I don't say the media in any light form, because I was just thinking, as Professor Best was presenting, it's not too often that you're sitting watching the television here in Australia, and during a program it'll say news coming on at 11, and I'm just almost facetiously thinking to myself, how long will it be until they say something like, convicted car thief has relapsed, details at 11. That is just not the way they talk. It's reoffending, it's recidivism, it's these terminologies. And so it's going to take a lot to get that paradigm shift up. And if you don't have the paradigm shift upwardly managed in a strategic, effective fashion, you're not going to get the buy-in. And then it's also the strategic management and buy-in managing down, which is, again, like everybody else that's working in these organizations, youth justice workers, probation officers, community corrections officers, they have huge case files. And so, I take, for instance, one of our youth justice programs here in Australia, where we're saying, your organization is adopting desistance. And on average, their clients are with them for 7 months, right? And they will meet twice a week. And that's their total time with this client. Now, to gain desistance within that time, their comment is, well, what role am I playing in this? Is the role, and should the role be more towards, as Professor Best pointed out, making sure the links are there with the community? Is that the role towards desistance, which is very different from treatment program. And in addition to that, where's the resourcing going to come from? Because desistance is a needfully resourced element. And so, there's no doubt from my very, very humble experience that there's a passion and an openness within the correctional systems to adopt this. But certainly from an Australian perspective, from the touch points I've had, there's still a lot to be done in terms of the devil in the detail, which is, what do you expect us to do? And what will our role be? And to be quite honest, how will the commissioners and the politicians sell, quote unquote, this to the people who are the taxpayers in many respects? So I think, again, aside from showing the effectiveness of these programs and this movement, there's also how do we sell it? And without that sale, the implementation buy-in tends to depreciate. So I'll just leave it there. But that was my kind of thoughts, and again, stolen thoughts from the from the people working front lines.
Thank you, Professor Pfeiffer. I especially like the point you mentioned about devils in the detail, about how to get things to going and to go beyond making sure one single program works, because we all know that it's not just one single program, it's a whole ecosystem, up and down, and vertically and laterally. Thank you so much. Next, I want to give the time to Professor Liu to share his views. Professor Liu, please.
Oh, thank you, Boon Siang. Did I freeze? Just want to also thank Professor Best for giving us new insights into the whole field of helping people to rehabilitate and reintegrate back into society. The whole topic of desistance really brings back a lot of memories for me, because like in the prison service that I used to work for, we started off, doing rehabilitation, focusing a lot on the individuals, focusing a lot on their skills, their deficits. And when desistance thinking started coming in and we started to think about, people making straight their lives, it brought a different perspective. And today, what Prof. Best shared about Chimes really struck a chord in me, because those concepts of connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment, I think these are very core principles that, in every rehabilitation effort that we make, in every engagement with inmates or offenders, if we don't try to bring this up in them, then it's all really just going above their heads. And one of the early things that really struck me about the whole desistance literature is this notion of hope. And the question I ask myself is, when we run a correctional system, does the system itself engender hope in the people in it? And hope is something that in a sense, for those of us who work with offenders or with incarcerated individuals, are we people that actually increase hope when we interact with them, or we kind of decrease their level of hope? And I think that speaks not just for correctional, for psychologists, counselors, but for correctional staff as well. And I'm really glad to see that over the years, I see that even desistance thinking has actually gotten into the Singapore Prison Service. And even our officers are talking about some of the work they do, where desistance thinking of helping people to have a sense of identity, bringing meaning to what they do, as one of the important roles that they do. And I think that really is one of the, I think, game-changing changes that I saw earlier on. And Chimes really put together these concepts pretty well. Just wanted to highlight that. The second thing that really struck me as we talked tonight, even as I hear Professor Best speak, is the whole area of peer learning. That I think Terence could talk more about it later, because we've had plenty of discussions on that. Because prisons is a place where, offenders spend a lot of time together. So traditionally, prisons are hothouse for to learn to be more antisocial, because you learn for the best offenders around. But how do we reverse this whole notion of peer learning in such a way that it becomes positive rather than negative? And I think a few years ago, prisons started this notion of the learning prison. And then again, I guess the devil is in the details. How do you make peer learning become alive, become part of the very fabric of a correctional system where you warehouse many offenders over long periods of time? Something that struck me today, even as I listened to an earlier sharing on the desistance journey of some of our drug offenders. I think one of our psychologists, Fan Chiang, was just sharing some of the stories, the anecdotes of people who persist in offending, the relapses, and people who desist after 5 years. And some of the narratives that she was talking about spoke of how different people dealt with different life circumstances, how someone who relapsed would deal with stress by going back to drugs or something like that. And a thought came to my mind as to whether if these anecdotes were made into little case studies and that's being shared and worked upon by offenders themselves, maybe facilitated by peers, then they can actually process what it's like to, encounter such situations when they actually eventually leave the prison and go back into society. It's very different when that's facilitated by a professional. But these kind of anecdotes that are from the lived experience of the sisters brought into among offenders, and then they are like what we do when we go for workshops. We do case studies. We look at a case and we kind of discuss the scenarios in the case. If we could do that with offenders, would that make a difference? And then where the sisters themselves co-facilitate such conversations and share some of the struggles they had. And that might complement some of the human skills learning that that's being done through the normal process of treatment delivery services. The other interesting thing that really came up for me was more of a question was about this thing about asset mapping. That the good thing about, I guess in Singapore, one of the strengths that we have is a thing called a care network, where agencies come together, they are as an organized group together with government bodies to have partnerships. And oftentimes the coming together of these groups form a community in themselves. And with this already set up, I'm curious about, what other training that these groups can have, like what Professor Best was talking about in terms of connectors. Are there room for, learning to be better connectors within these organizations as part of the care network? And how can the care network grow in some of these areas where partnerships become stronger? And maybe invite also smaller groups into the care network. And I think that's where maybe we haven't quite tapped. There's still room that we can grow in. So that's something that I think is worth thinking about. I thought of this thing, maybe becomes under meaning in the Chimes workshop, Chimes framework, but we talk about human capital and various capital. I also talk about spiritual capital, because I hear some of the experiences of offenders who have kind of desisting and are desisting, that they find a lot of their meaning in terms of their spiritual journey. Some of them go back to church. Some of them are involved in cell groups, and they find new connections. And I think that's partly something that, we could exploit even more, we could actually develop even more, is what are the kind of circles that our offenders are involved in. And I think in Singapore society, and at least talking about Singapore, religion is still quite an important aspect of the life of many of the people here. So the question is, how do we then work more with the religious organizations to increase that level of engagement in the community aspect of their faith? I think some faiths have more developed pastoral care, others may develop that more. And the question is, how do we then do that such that the offenders can have naturally occurring communities where they feel a part of, they can contribute back in terms of in a generative way, like what Chet Marina talks about in generative work, and what Professor Best talks about when people give back and get involved in meaningful activity, they actually stay away from drugs, stay away from crime. So just some thoughts that I have to share. It's not very organized, it's just bits and pieces that I've picked up, but it kind of inspired me to just think further into that. Thank you, Boon Siang. Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Liu. Thanks for sharing your interpretation of the CHIME model. And it's so important because most of the correctional system has been applying the R&R model, where it has also been misinterpreted as a risk and deficit model. Plus, public has expectations of what the prison should be like, right? Yeah, so you combine these two, people who go through prisons, it could be a more criminogenic experience, making it worse for them. That's why it's so important to bring back the hope, empowerment, and identity for them. And now let me invite Deputy Commissioner Goh to share your views. Deputy Commissioner, please.
Thanks, Boon Siang. I'm in the midst of erudite eminent psychologists. I'm no psychologist, so pardon me if I stray a bit. Yeah, I really like the CHIME acronym. I think Singaporeans, we love acronym. We have an acronym for almost everything. But I think, and also I think earlier on, Timothy also mentioned about the care network that we have formed. It's a loose coalition of a group of agencies from the private, public, and people sectors. We come together, collaborated. These are the agencies that work in the care network. In fact, the three values that undergird this care network, which is hope, confidence, and opportunities. And basically, this is what we attempt to do. Early on, we talk about R&R, a lot of personal transformation, personal rehabilitation, but Desistance is about going beyond that, right? And this is what we are all talking about. And this network was formed sometime in 2001, if I remember correctly. And this is where our journey started for Singapore, right? We started and we recognized the importance of community organizations coming together to help the offenders, ex-offenders to stay straight, provide the support. And over here, we have two saying, prisoners have, they are in two prisons. The first prison is a physical prison. The second prison, when they step out of the physical prison, they enter the second prison, which is the community, right? Because incarceration, imprisonment comes with a lot of stigma, and some of them feel ostracized, and the acceptance by the community is extremely important, right? Be it jobs, employment, friends, families, and I think that is crucial. This is what we're talking about early on, right? What is the identity of the offenders when they enter the prison? And when they come out, do they come out as drug addicts? Do they come out as ex-offenders? Or such identity gets cemented when they spend their time in the prisons. And that sort of identity transformation is extremely important when they step out. And how do we go about actually promoting that identity change? Over here, I think one of the important thing about helping offenders to reintegrate is the community, is the public perception of ex-offenders. How do you go about changing the mindset towards them? And under the care network, we started an initiative called the Yellow Ribbon Project. So under the Yellow Ribbon Project, basically is giving second chances to ex-offenders, right? And the 3 A's to this project, which is create awareness, create subsequent generate acceptance, and rally actions, like the 3 A's, right? We need to create awareness of the plights or challenges, difficulties faced by offenders who come out of prisons, right? And then with that understanding, with that empathy, they will be able to accept them, and hopefully we can garner actions to take concrete actions to help offenders to reintegrate back and to support them. So the 3 A's are, and this is what undergirds all the activities that we do, right? Whether be it a mass run to rally the public, to support, to cheer the ex-offenders on, or we organize activities such as culinary competition, singing competitions, or even arts competition, to help the offenders know that they do have talents, they do have liability, they do have assets in them. They are not a person with deficits. They are not someone that need to be fixed. They're not someone who has no strengths at all. So these are the kind of things that we do to hopefully transform that sort of identity. Of course, there are many other things that we do in the prison systems to help offenders to rethink their roles as father, rethink their roles as husband, rethink their roles as a child, for example, right? So yeah, so I think early on, Tim talked about peer learning prison. This is also one of our strategy that we have conceptualized a couple of years ago. Prison should be a place of learning. In prison, there are subcultures. Inmates come from different backgrounds. Some have gang affiliations. They come in. So the sort of subcultures actually sometimes mitigate against rehabilitation activities. They come in, they do all sorts of activities which are not right, and that actually undermine the rehabilitation activities. So this is what we're trying to do, to create a different culture, to change the culture. Hopefully through that transformation, there's law and order in prisons, and there are good values being imparted, And hopefully we can continue with our rehabilitation programs, and the programs are not disrupted by fights, by gangs activities. Yep. So the point about learning is extremely important. Is also, I think, the other aspect of the learning prison strategy that we have is also to give a sense of accountability and ownership to the offenders, so that they can decide what sort of courses they want to take, what sort of programs they want to participate in, what sort of change. And that is the kind of conversation that need to take place with the prison officers, with the counselors, with our psychologists. Yep, I think time is up.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Goh, and for sharing numerous strategies put in place by Prison Service. Of significance, I think, is the Care Network and the Yellow Ribbon Project, which plays a big role in facilitating secondary and tertiary desistance process. Last but not least, let me invite Professor Best. Share your thoughts on this topic or reactions to the three panelists sharing. Professor Best, please.
Okay, well, first, I'd want to say apologies to everyone who's already had to listen to me for an hour. So I will not take up my full time, because I think we should move on to discussion. Second, thank you to all of my fellow panelists for their generous and kind thoughts. And really what I want to do, I want to give two examples, and one of them directly picks on that notion of peer strengths that we just heard the Commissioner speaking about. So I work in a prison called HMP Wymont, which is an unusual prison, because it's a 1,200 capacity adult male prison, half of which is a local category C prison for offenders, half is for sex offenders. And so it makes doing joint things quite difficult. But one of the things we've done there, and we're just beginning to get it back going again after COVID, is because of problems with education provision, we've been getting the prisoners to work out what they could teach other prisoners about. So we've been doing asset auditing. And so we ended up having conversational Cantonese classes, conversational Spanish classes. We even indeed had a knitting class, and it was one of my academic ambitions was to write a paper on knitting in prison, but I haven't quite got to that yet. And the idea there is very much, there was no resource for educational provision. So what can prisoners, and they did a bit of quality control about it as well. I'm going to say a little bit more about the Family Connectors program that we did at HMP Kirkham, an open prison where we brought family members in to effectively take on a kind of probation role, which was around identifying what people's interests were and passions were post-release, and trying to, so the family members acted as the bridge to get people into sport and recreation, college courses, and so on. And now, going back to HMP Wymont, when somebody comes in for the first time and they've been booked in reception, on day one, they fill in a 4-question form that asks them, what are your passions? What are your interests? What would you like to develop as skills while you're in prison? And what would you like to be able to do when you come out of prison? And for some of the prisoners, they almost think these are trick questions because they've never been asked anything like this before, and they're wondering what the hell are they up to asking me this stuff. And it's about culture change. Now, I'm sure everyone in the panel could cite examples of some of these fabulous innovative processes. And it's one of the things that's kind of blighted my career is I go from recovery organization to recovery organization, astonished by some of their incredible innovations. And yet nobody knows about them. People still are reinventing square wheels because we're very good at sharing information about risk and deficit and risk management, but we're rubbish at sharing information about innovation and success and strength building. And I think part of it is cultural, the risk aversiveness of a lot of criminal justice agencies. Some of it is occupational, because I think there's a real sense of concern that these are professional roles that have been handed to peers. Yet in time of austerity, professionals just don't have the time or capacity to do these things. Third, and I think one of the fundamental challenges is belief in the capacity of people to change. So my old boss when I worked at the Maudsley was a man called Professor Mike Gossip. And he used to talk about the clinical paradox of drug workers. If you worked in a drug agency, you saw two lots of drug users. people who never left your services and people who were in a revolving door in and out. In other words, you thought everybody failed because you never saw success. And I think there's that danger in justice services as well. They do risk reduction and deficit management. And so for me, the questions really are about imaginative and creative commissioning. It seems to me some of it, if we were looking at outcomes, we want to start thinking about outcomes, things like, how do you break intergenerational cycles? So we know, for instance, when an alcoholic goes into 12-step groups, their children achieve better developmental milestones and better school achievements. Yet we don't count this as a recovery outcome, but as a crucial outcome because you're effectively interfering with the intergenerational transmission of adversity. And so we need to think, I think, more collaboratively and creatively about how we measure these things. But I think as academics, we've kind of failed to some extent in our ability to say, how do we measure strengths and how do we measure some of those positive contagion effects? Because the danger is, one Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons described this to me as the starburst effect. All these lovely strength-based things are great, but they're all based on personality. They're time limited, they burn brightly and they burn out. Well, that seems to me a failure of both the designers of the programme and the commissioners of the prisons. And we need to think much more dynamically and creatively about how we both compile evidence and how we identify the vital ingredients. So I'm going to stop there. That just strikes me as I'm sure everybody could give fabulous and innovative examples of strength, but I think the bigger question is, how do we start collating that evidence and persuading our commissioners that these add significantly not only value for money, but real opportunities to make lasting changes?
Thank you, Professor Best. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just wonder any of the panelists have any reactions or response to anyone? You can see people nodding, writing down notes. I just wonder anyone has any points that you want to build on? Nope. All right, let's dive into the Q&A. As you were sharing, I already have numerous questions coming in, but I'll take advantage of my position as a moderator and ask 2 questions first. First, in relation to Professor Best's point about, if I try to summarize, it seems to suggest that the agents in the correctional system tend to amplify or be preoccupied with risk factors. It seems that one risk factor would negate or override whatever gains or strengths a person have made in prison. How do we convince the leaders, the decision makers in the correctional system to not be so obsessed with the risk, but pay attention to the other strengths-based or positive factors? Any thoughts?
I'm going to start by talking about what academics need to do. I think we need much stronger conceptual models, testable empirical models that allow us to have some kind of measure of justice capital and to show what outcomes it leads to. I think, there's been a danger. We've done an awful lot of kind of qualitative case study type models. We need something much more ambitious and akin to a recovery capital model that allows us both to capture and consistently measure strength-based programs and to know what we want from them as a mechanism of not just so we can produce individuals and say, look, this person got a job and did great, but so we can start to say, here are the costs of a program like this, and here are the likely benefits, and here are the ripple effects. Because one of the criticisms of restorative justice research was it failed to capture adequately secondary gains, the impact on the family, the impact on the community. And with any strength-based project, that's going to be the benefit of it is partly about that much broader look beyond the individual change. So for me, there's an academic challenge here about demonstrating both adequate metrics and then turning them into cost effectiveness and health economic type outcomes.
Thank you, Professor Best.
And if I could, I'd just add to that, I think that's a brilliant insight is what what do we need to do as academics, because we have a defined role. I would push that even further and say, in my experience, my humble experience, it's the stall is not with the commissioners and individuals running these organizations. They're on board. It's trying to convince their taskmasters, so to speak, which are the politicians and ultimately the taxpayer. And I think one of the things academics have not done is gone to the politicians and said, what do you need in terms of proof to sell this to your electorate? We just have not done that. And what we've traditionally fallen back on is look, just do the economics, right? I mean, we all know it costs $100,000 a year and that should be enough for you, member of parliament to sell this to your, and it isn't. And so I would push this even further, Professor Best, and suggest, we need to go right to the core and say, look, what can we as academics put together for you to sell this to your electorate? And I don't think that's done commonly. It should be, but it's a very, and so again, I don't think it's the commissioners for the most part. They're on board. It's just going up and saying, how do you want to, because they want to be reelected. Let's call it what it is. And so I think, again, I would just push it even one level further and saying, what can we do to supply that for you?
Thank you so much.
Just to join the conversation, I'll steer clear from the politician talk. But basically, I think for our psychologists in Singapore Prison Service, I think they did a marvelous job in convincing us that the importance of risk, needs assessment, and we are so well schooled in that, and of course that also goes in line with our general training. Now we manage risk, we protect society, and we mitigate risks. So we are generally tend to be a bit more risk averse. Of course, I think the R&R also has very strong empirical foundation, right? And of course, desistance is much later on, and the practice for desistance is still not very clear. I mean, as far as I understand, as far as I know, I mean the domains are clear to a certain, but in terms of translating to practice, how do I go about? Although again, we heard about ABCD and from Chimes and things like these are all very important. I mean, not that we don't believe in that. So I think as administrator, we want the best of both worlds. We want R&R, and at the same time, we want to do the other part for longer recidivism, better recidivism, a longer period of time, like 5 years or 5 to 7 each. Around you mentioned, for desistance to be sustainable, you need to be beyond 5 to 7. So these are the kind of lens that we are putting on. Of course, the other aspect is also about resources, budget. And in the area of research, the research cannot be just cross-sectional or just one by cohort, but it would have to be a longer period of time, to follow through, to follow up, and then of course we demand evidence. What's the local evidence, right? I mean, you're telling me about overseas evidence, but what is local? What is there to and also in Singapore we're cosmopolitan, right? Different races. There are cultural aspect to that as well. So I think until we'll hold the good practices on desistance, what they do in terms of increasing social, human, or even community capital, but of course we want to keep the other side of the story. We're not going to throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Thank you so much, Deputy Commissioner Goh, for raising the source issue.
Yeah, I just thought years ago when I remember a time in Singapore history that the whole rehabilitation enterprise wasn't something that was accepted as that it's good money to be put in, at least from a policymaker's point of view. Should the money be spent in other places? But because we were able to kind of marshal the evidence to say that, well, overseas literature shows that it does work and we can apply it and try it out. And so basically, I think today policymakers are clear that there's evidence behind rehabilitation. It's not just money that could be well spent somewhere else. But having done that, the rhetoric has still been, R&R has actually been kind of part of the landscape now for quite many years. So the expansion of more desistance-oriented and kind of social capital language and the matrix that come to bear need to then be developed and be brought into the discussions at the policy level. And I think academics one side, and then you have policymakers the other side, and then you have the people that work in between, the administrators, the professionals. And I think these are the people that need to do the translation work, because then there needs to be trust. Because sometimes when the policymakers look at the academics, they say, oh, you're in your ivory tower, you do all these things. And then, and then traditionally the academics look at the policymakers, say, oh, just looking at the beans, counting beans, and not looking at people and the data, So basically there needs to be a translation of the research into the practice, and maybe the people that are in between these two need to all come together such that there is actually trust. The other thing that I think is very important is that the government of the day and the system that the offenders are part of, that there has to be trust between the public and the government in terms of safety and security. Therefore, if there's mutual trust, then a lot of experimentation can take place. I think it's harder in certain societies or certain parts of societies where the media is always against, offenders. Every time there's a rape case, it's blown out and someone gets raped, and then everyone gets really wound up about sexual stuff and, sexual crimes. And that becomes very, very hard for correctional systems to even, get public trust in that. So I think this whole notion of public trust, I think, is also another area in which, as we work, and therefore, how do you manage risk if there's trust versus in a place where there's no trust? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you so much, panelists, for raising all these systemic and macro issue. Let's bring attention back to the audience question. I have one that asks about how do you imagine desistance be applied for persistent offenders who by the time they are released, they could be in their elderly age? Yeah. Anyone, please.
Well, I'm going to start with the comparison with older people in recovery. So when Granfield and Cloud wrote the first paper on recovery capital, they regarded 4 factors as negative recovery capital. And it's kind of really interesting to think of them. 2 are obvious. Long histories of incarceration, well, not surprising. Second one was significant enduring mental health problems, again, not surprising. The other 2 were more contentious because they argued that being female and being older were in themselves intrinsic barriers to change. And I guess part of a maturing out career type model would assume that people reduce their connections to pro-social activities and so on as their careers develop. Now, I have a PhD student at the moment who's looking at late and early onset alcohol problems in older drinkers. So there is now a significant issue, and the person who's asked this question is absolutely right to do so. As we increasingly have aging populations in the justice system, and particularly in prison, we do need to think about specific models and pathways for engaging them, because I think the general assumption is that for most people that what's the way of creating desistance? It's give everybody a 30th birthday card and hope that they change after that. So, for me, there's something really important here. And I think the question is about the same basic set of principles. Start with, say, a safe place to live that's free from threat. That would be some kind of pathway to some kind of meaningful thing. And in my PhD student, his work is all about the idea of existential purpose. So it's meaning in 2 senses. One, it's meaning in the sense of something to fill your day, but you're not bored and pointless, because those are the things that in the CHIME model that would fundamentally impact on your ability to have a positive self-identity and self-esteem and self-efficacy. So but also, I think especially with older people, there's much more of that kind of existential sense of what's the point and what's the meaning. So that may well involve links to churches, links to other kind of organizations where those kind of things might play out. And then I think the other crucial factor is relational. We know that where people are building bridges to families and connections to relationships, and also allowing people to be the wounded healer. You know, I think that older group are potentially much better served in a position to act as peer mentors, peer champions, peer navigators. And all of which I think I am speculating. It's important to admit that I'm speculating, because I think whoever asked the question is absolutely right. Not only is it an underserved population, it's a significantly understudied population. And while I think there are some generalizable rules, one of the things with my recovery work that I'm increasingly conscious of is there are very clear geographic, cultural specificities to recovery. There's not a set of universal principles now, and there's no reason for assuming age wouldn't be one of those key factors that you should assume. There will be variabilities in pathways to desistance.
Thank you, Professor Best. Yeah, Professor Pfeiffer, please.
Just I add quickly that you know, one other group that's very interesting from a from this perspective is when we talk about the R&R model. One global group that has always had trouble with that from a forensic criminological approach are the Indigenous people, be they of Canada, of Australia, of New Zealand, of the US, etc. And one of the reasons is it went against their idea of focusing on the positive and the community, as opposed to the R&R model focusing on, you know, granting there are strengths and protective factors, but really focusing on the negative aspects. And they've never really been comfortable with this model, and now we've got a model that we're saying, oh my goodness, look, isn't this a more positive based, community engaged approach, which in many respects is very similar to the approaches of the Maori people, or the Navajo people, or the Cree people of Canada, etc. And so we've got this interesting kind of juxtaposition where we're now coming around to their approach. But as far as I can see, there's been very, and Professor Best might be better positioned to correct me if I'm wrong, and I could very well be. I'm seeing very little of researchers and academics going to these Indigenous groups and saying, you know, this really does reflect your perspective. What have you got for us? And I think they'll have some incredible insight, because this has always been their kind of resistance to the R&R model. So, you know, again, there might be a good chance to again get some information from groups as academics.
Yeah, and I'd say two examples of where I think this is working well. One, I've been privileged to work beside a fabulous Indigenous elder in Western Australia called Sharon Hamilton, and her and I worked on a paper on justice capital, working with Aboriginal youth in Western Australia, which was just an amazing thing. And the second one is I do some work in a drug court in Auckland, which has a Pauaranga, a Maori cultural advisor who works in the court. And one of the most astonishingly moving experiences of my career has been watching the entire court sing the Serenity Prayer associated with Alcoholics Anonymous in Maori at the start of each session of that drug court. Now, these are lovely, innovative examples. The science falls way behind, and our willingness and ability to include a representative from those populations is genuinely appalling. And I think you could say that for many, many cultural groups. And I don't think any of our countries could claim exceptionalism for that.
I think one of the audience also asked questions related to culture, and also wondered what are the recommended research approach would you recommend to understand more about, you know, how culture plays a part in facilitating desistance process?
Well, I think my colleague, Stephen Farrell, has done some really interesting work in the UK around desistance and culture. And he had a PhD student called Dana Segev, who did some comparative work on desistance in the UK and Israel. So comparative studies, crucially important. Ethnography, massively, massively important. And I think there's a real temptation to say it should be primarily qualitative work, but I don't think it should be primarily qualitative work. I think it should be co-produced, mixed methods work, which is about capacity building. So in my work with the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organizations, one of the things we did was we trained 31 people in recovery to be researchers, to be peer researchers, to gather data on their own recovery organisations. And that kind of capacity building strikes me as absolutely crucial if we're serious about cultural engagement. But it has to come earlier than just involving people in the delivery of the research. They have to be involved in the design of programs of work and what comes next. So, you know, I think that so that we don't end up just having our own pat theories neatly confirmed by how we choose to involve people in them. So I think this is a complex area. I think there are examples of how it can be done very well.
Thank you for the thought. Professor Pfeiffer, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, again, it's you know, you cannot do a one size fits all. It doesn't matter if it's desistance, R&R model, et cetera. And I think, you know, Professor Best has said it. And I just reinforce that you have to go to the people and you have to say, you know, what is the fit here? And if it doesn't fit, how can we then, you know, because we don't want to make the same mistake as R&R, which was it's a one size fits all. And then, of course, we might be able to adapt it for the indigenous people. We might be able to adapt it for an African population. But, you know, we don't want to change the words on the LSI or the YLS, you know, because we change, you know, Terence, you would know this inside out. You change one word, you lose all the empirical evidence. And so if you lose all the empirical evidence, now where are we? And so, you know, I don't think we want to make those same mistakes. I think it's a good time to learn from that. And part of that is I think including all cultural aspects as well as other aspects from the beginning, as opposed to developing for the average white adult male out of America, for example, and then saying all other elements are adaptive. And so, you know, again, let's learn from that from the past.
Thank you so much. There's a question from the audience about how do we sustain the longevity of the positive effects that are gained in prison so that it sustained through the offender's reintegration process. No? How can we help to sustain these recovery gains as the person reintegrate? Any thoughts?
So it's continuity. For me, it's absolutely about continuity. So in one of the prisons that I work in, HMP Alt course in Liverpool, there's a fabulous 12-step program delivered in cells to people in prison. And it's delivered by peers, but peers who come from outside. And the point of the 12-step program delivered in prisons is they are both attempting to change the culture in the prison, but crucially, those same peers do the through the gate process. In other words, they develop the relationship with drinking and drug using offenders, but they are also the ones who meet people at the gate, take them to recovery housing, and get them involved in community recovery programs, the same person. And those peer workers are all people who themselves are ex-inmates of HMP Alt course. So there's a lived experience trust about this process. And for me, how do you do it? You stop thinking about magic boxes of tricks where programs work and transform lives. You have a meaningful sense of pathways and continuity. And it's not simple. It's incredibly resource intensive and takes a lot of passion and commitment. But I can't see anything else that works anywhere near as well.
Thank you. The other panelists, any thoughts on this question on how to help to sustain recovery gains made in prisons?
I think a thought that came to my mind was this whole idea of the whole challenge of how to help them to transition and the transitional pathway for different offenders are very different. So the question is, how do we individualize some of this? Because, and we do have local data, right, to show that, you know, the longer people stay, for example, in a job, the longer they'll desist. And once you stop working in the first 6 months, you know, your chance of coming back to prison is much higher. And then the question again would be that, again, coming back to how do we map the needs that they have and the need for social grouping, engagement, so the social bonds that they have. And I think, I guess the first few years would be where a lot of the investment has to be to buttress them. And I guess the better we do it as a community, the more robust I think would be their chance of survival in the community and basically was taking from what Professor Best was talking about, the use of peers to actually help them along the way. And I think this is an area that I guess there's a lot more work to be done.
Mm.
The other way is also strengthening the families, the families of the offenders themselves, because it's quite a challenge for them as well. Yeah. Those are my two thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think for me, one of the ways is to see how we can provide a step-down approach for offenders before they are totally released from custody. I think sometimes we release directly from prisons, there will be a cliff drop effect. So the kind of hand-holding is extremely important, especially the first 6 to a year or so, not within in the community. So you have a semi-structured, putting them on some kind of monitoring, surveillance, or I think those could be useful. Of course, come together with support. So I think the approach needs to be quite practical, right? So for example, in prisons, in our surveys, we bring in NA into our system, expose the drug inmates with such a modality, such a protocol, so that when they are out in the community, we can kind of nudge them to join some of these NA. Now, of course, this is something that we are also in the midst of developing to see how we can incentivize the participation in some of these NA. So basically to create an environment where they can strengthen some of these social bonds with recovery, right? Because, I mean, for example, NA is about serving, right? I mean, one of the 12 steps is serving, coming at end to themselves. So these are the values that we also want to actually inculcate, which are extremely important from a recovery perspective. Yeah. So I think strengthening the bond is important. Of course, not just NA or AA groups. The other groups, like earlier on, I think Professor Best mentioned about the recreation groups, sports group, different kind of interest groups, church groups, whatever groups are where they can establish good relationship, strengthen the bond. Of course, sometimes some of this bond also is also bridging bond, which are very useful for them to connect to other subgroups as well. And this is where the pro-social effect will take its course.
Thank you so much. I know we are about to run out of time, but I want to slip in one last question. I think my colleagues asked these questions about what are the indicators we can measure to track the desistance process of offenders. What are some of the indicators?
For me, you have to go for a combination of 3 different things. One, you have to go for self-report measures. It's really important we get subjective individual experience lived component of this. 2, we have to go for some non-subjective measures, which are around things like housing benefits claims, arrests, reoffending rates, and we wouldn't ever want to be overly reliant on any of them. And thirdly, and I think the most complex, is the kind of collective indicators we'd want about ultimate targets around collective efficacy, community involvement, NGOs and volunteering rates, active citizenship and participation. And if you wanted negative versions of them, you'd look at overall crime rates, overall drug use rates, overdose deaths. So you're looking at public health and public safety measures as well. Ultimately, and it's a big ask because of attributional fractions and so on, but it's really important we don't lose sight, and particularly given the entirely right earlier comment about convincing politicians, at some point we have to grasp that nettle and say, if you do this well, this is what you get.
Thank you, Professor Best. Professor Pfeiffer, any thoughts on this?
I think Professor Best has summed it up. That's the multi-method, and then I think that starts the trend towards supplying the ear of the politicians and their electorate. So I think that's concur.
Thank you so much, all panelists. Really, thanks for this engaging discussion. I believe the audience have benefited from your sharing. And dear delegates, let's give our panelists a round of virtual applause and words of appreciation in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Boon Siang and Sang Long.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
And dear conference delegates, before you leave, I would like to invite you to give your feedback via the platform sidebar on the left under the More option and look for Day 2 evaluation to give your feedback. We're keen to know how you felt about the presentations and what else we can do to improve ACOP in the future. Please spend a minute to give us your candid feedback. Tomorrow's conference program will commence with a masterclass on Introduction to Forensic Report Writing by Dr. Edward Ong from Coventry University for invited delegates at 1:30 p.m. Singapore time. Then at 4 p.m., the conference will start the program under the Organization, Leadership and Technology track. And we have come to the end of Day 2 of ACOP 2022. Thank you and see you tomorrow.